thank you very much. What I suggest now is that we have comments or questions. Give us your name first, and so we kind of get to know each other a little bit. And what I think I'll do, unless there's very few questions to start out with, is take, say, 3 questions or comments first, and then let the panel respond, and then get back to you. Otherwise, you know, they'll just do all the talking, and we won't get enough from you. So.
For your purposes, there are microphones on each side. This is being recorded, so either if you don't mind repeating the question, you can do it that way, or if you want to speak to the question directly in the microphone, that would probably work best.
You said it. I thought she was going to the... We thought you were going to the microphone. There's a question here. Please. Yep.
This whole topic that we discussed today must include in it the word responsibility, which I did not hear at all. To the extent that an individual takes the stand, willingly takes the stand to be responsible for something, they can do something about it. We raise our children to be at best responsible for themselves. We need to raise our children to take the stand for everything and everyone, at least for in our own country. And as our consciousness grows, we can take the stand to include others. Only in this way we can talk about pluralism. Otherwise, the whole concept is just wild. It doesn't explain anything. Could you comment on that, please?
You didn't give us your name.
Oh. My name is Edward Atraji. I'm an alumnus of Carleton University.
Thank you. Anybody else? I know it's always a sort of that moment of transition from this to that. So maybe if you want to take up the issue of responsibility.
Pass the ball around. I'll say, yeah. I have a little issue with the concept of responsibility and how much it seems to imply that it rests in the willingness of the individual to take responsibility. And part of the problem that I see with that notion of responsibility, which is not necessarily always the case, but just for the sake of discussion, I'm trying to think in the present situation in terms of obligation more than responsibility. In a world that has moved in which individualism has become entrenched, and the notion of the individual has become entrenched, and the individual as the unit and the basic unit that decide and choose path, and then decide to take or not to take responsibility. If we look around, I think that has gone pretty bad. And then it seems to me that relying on responsibility to address the kind of problematic that I'm thinking of, for example, what will come under the label of the Anthropocene, it might fall short, where we have to try to create the attachment and develop the attachment and the infrastructures that, for me, it rings better with the sense of obligation to others, and that it doesn't end up simply in a choice. Oh, I will take responsibility because I'm a good person, or because I want to be good, but actually something that is much more intense, much more profound. That the attachments, like you were mentioning our children, and in many sense, I feel obligations to a lot of things in relation to my son, it doesn't mean that it's like, oh, I have to do this, I don't want to do it, but it's strenuous many times, the thing that you have to do because you are obligated to your children and to others. So just for the sake of discussion.
So may I respond?
Very briefly, because I can see there's two people
Okay.
over at the other mic.
So responsibility is not something that can be imposed on you. You have to actually take it upon yourself. Nobody can impose a responsibility on you. The other thing is that to the extent that you do not take responsibility, we need policing. We need to make sure that you do not overstep your boundaries. So as you take responsibility, you expand your boundaries. As you lessen your responsibilities, you shrink your boundaries.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are we live?
Yeah, you just need to speak more directly.
Thank you.
With point it down right now.
Okay. Thank you. Ben Novak. I'm in the applied sciences, so my questions are going to be very direct and probably not sophisticated. But anyway, first I'd like to thank the speakers because this is my first presence in a political science context. And I tend to try and learn something from each speaker. So I'm going to read the 2 or 3 concepts, or words actually, that each speaker impressed on me. And Professor Jaeger first, story versus history. I'll leave it there. Professor Rojas, land versus territory. And Professor Blaser, the earth is not a stage, but it is at stake, or something to that effect. I think it was a quotation. It may not be your original. So my question now is, after we've heard what the Western history, the Euro history, has done to indigenous peoples all over the world, not necessarily in Latin America or in North America, but also in Africa and so on. And we now reap the benefits not only of ecological destruction, but also of migration. And I would like each panelist to tell me what they think, to relate all this to the present, what they think that the massive migrations that are forecast might actually do to the Eurocentric history. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll take your question too, AJ. So,
yeah, thanks a lot for the talk. My name is AJ. I'm a student here at Carleton. I wanted to pick up on Hans Martin's point about self-estrangement. I think it actually kind of speaks to some of the broader questions of responsibility and what's happening now. And it's related, I think, too, in terms of how people try to do research between worlds, between ontologies. So it's a general question for everyone. I'm just wondering, does this concept of self-estrangement from Western modernity, is that sort of like a necessary preparation for sort of traveling between ontologies? You know, in the same way that an astronaut trains for forever to go up into space, do we need to go through, as people trained in modernity, as we all are in the university, do we need to go through this kind of rigorous estrangement in order to be able to do research that requires us to move between worlds? And I'm wondering for Cristina and Mario, who have done more direct work in other worlds to some degree, what was your process? How did you prepare yourself to be able to navigate between ontologies?
I think I see a third question, my magic third.
Yeah, okay. Thanks. My name is Zoe, and I'm really, fascinated by the examples you've given today of sort of resistance to colonial politics and sort of control of land and territory in South America. And I have no experience working in South America, but I'd be kind of interested in sort of the interrelationships between resistance here in North America and indigenous sort of ontologies and legal orders, and how have you seen sort of some work between these different geographies and territories? I know in Canada, a lot of leaders have spent time traveling to other indigenous territories to learn about how indigenous peoples elsewhere are articulating their nationhood and sovereignty. And so I'm kind of interested in, things here obviously different territories, but I'm kind of interested in whether you've come across sort of an intersection between these resistances, and if you think it's a fruitful space for us to look at collaboration and informing one another across our philosophies. So thanks.
Thank you. Well, Cristina or no.
Okay, maybe I start with the latest and then the previous one. I was reading, or we have a reading group, and we was reading the book by Coulthard, and he has a chapter on territory. So I was very interested in that chapter. And he tells several stories, and I was very impressed with one of them, and he quotes another, I don't remember, indigenous intellectual. And he said that for indigenous, the concept of territory is very important. And he said that the difference between indigenous enacting of the war and Western is that Western think in terms of history, in terms of time, while indigenous think in terms of space, in terms of territory. And I think that's very important. If we go back, we're talking about Chakrabarti and provincializing Europe, in the sense that the time that was put into that historical narrative, it was a time where indigenous people and others, not only indigenous people, were left in the waiting room of history, that sometime they will arrive, and how time has become a very important instrument of coloniality. And I think that's this reinforce the view of relationality, that is in the sense that, say, why indigenous people across the Americas. I was listening to a woman in Guatemala was the same, similar thoughts. Is exactly how some of these universalisms of these policies about territory impinge or affect indigenous people, and that is the type of connections or partial connections that the indigenous movement are doing across America and across the world to respond to these policies. And I think that will be related also to the issue of migration. I am not an expert on migration. A lot of people, I think, like I've seen here some experts on migration, so I will encourage somebody of the audience also to talk about it. But I think that this deterritorialization in terms of people getting out of the territory, not only in terms of economic, but also in terms of problems with the environment, problems with lack of means, problems with war, I think also put the issue of territory not only in terms of what is going on in the third world, but also put the issue of territory of what is happening in Europe. I think it's a coming back of the topic of territory, going back to Europe and to the colonizer. I read the other day a story that is very interesting, that what is happening right now, especially with the crisis in Europe also, is that the colonizer or Europeans are going a lot to Africa and to Brazil and going back as a response. And I think this movement of people, and I think, Eja, are you going to talk about that this afternoon? Yeah. A little bit, yeah. So I think that's part of this centrality of territory and the stories built about territory. So.
Regarding the north and south, I work with the Shiro in Paraguay and have been working for some years with Innu in Labrador. And one of the things that for me has been really illuminating is that there is a substratum of commonalities, but the communication between movements is very difficult too, because of the assumptions of the, let's call it the political milieu in which colonialism has developed in North America and in South America, and the histories. For example, a very clear one, I mean, like the political milieu of resistance in largely pretty much all of Latin America is strongly inflected by Marxism. And that's part of the political milieu in which indigenous mobilizations occurs. So there is a lot of traffic on that space, which is not the case in North America. So on the one hand, you have also a story or a history in North America of difference being enforced as a governance system through the Indian Act and so on and so forth, the recognition of, or pseudo-recognition of tribal sovereignty in the states and so on and so forth, while in Latin America there is no Indians. That was the policy of the nation state. It was the disappearance of, and so these kind of things make it sometimes very difficult. I have staged a few encounters with indigenous intellectuals from North and South America, and until they can click, there is all this process you have to put in the translation process. You know, say, oh, okay, this is what we are, because the assumptions it start with, okay, we are in the same situation. Yes, but not, and that's a very interesting thing to navigate. Now, talking about this navigation and going to your question, Ajay, I think that it's very important that when we are talking about ontologies and the pluriverse, is to move away from a notion of a relation between billiard balls, like each ontology is a world that is in itself contained, and that ontologies map into groups. Oh, the ontology of the modern, the ontology of the Western European, or the ontology of the Ishiro, or the ontology of the Innu, or the... Because we have to try to think of ontology in a dynamic way as a verb, is a practice, is something that is being done, is something that is permanently being done. When you walk away from that notion of ontology as a secluded world, then the question of how you move between, you are experiencing permanently. Because modernity as an ontology in this sense is a series of practices that, of course, it clot, if you want, it realized in institutions, in very defined practices, but it doesn't occupy the whole space of your life, even if you are modern, supposedly. And this goes in connection with Hans Martin's idea of self-estrangement. You know, you have all these sort of things happening all the time that are not quite modern. But that doesn't mean that the concept of modern to try to grasp certain kind of practices is not applicable. Because this is also a tendency, you know, okay, well, if you cannot kind of define something specific, well, it's a hybrid. Everything is a hybrid. And then we end up with having nothing to say about. I mean, like it's all a hybrid. And so how do you distinguish one hybrid from another? Then the question of how you sort of prepare yourself to work, I mean, it's already in you. I think that it has to do more than anything with a kind of detecting the difference, being advice as to the different practices where you say, okay, well, this is a practice that is different, that is generating something different. Invocation of God in a ritual of the state, let's say. Well, there you have a cut. But then at the same time, you have a lot of things that wouldn't quite fly in many situations. I mean, and invoking God to, let's say, in court, to say, well, no, because God mandated that you go to jail, or something of the like, it wouldn't fly in a modern state. but it doesn't take away that there is these other practices going around too. So, what other thing was there? The Earth drama, the thing that I mentioned, that was basically this idea of Chakrabarty that he's basically arguing that there have been a convergence of natural history and human history. Up to now, we had assumed that whatever the humans were doing, we have a stage, we have a scenario, and that the Earth was that scenario, was fixed there, and we play our dramas and whatever, that was something that was stable. Well, now with the Anthropocene, what happens is that what we do is at the same time remaking the stage in which we are playing our dramas. So basically, the planet is at the center of the drama that we are running.
May I just ask a follow-up question? Is that your quotation or is it someone else's quotation?
No, I'm quoting, that's Chakrabarty's idea.
Okay. The reason being that, and I'm going to drift into something else that is interesting to me, sustainable design.
Sustainable?
Sustainable design, what we do to the Earth in a sustainable way. I'm going to use this quotation in my own talks to people about sustainable design. So there's a connection.
Thank you. Hans Martin.
Okay, so I've had some time to think about these very good and difficult questions. I'm not sure if I really have very good answers, so but I'll try to make some comments in the order of the questions. So migrations and what they do to sort of the concept of a Eurocentric history. I mean, this is of course a very large subject. I mean, migration is many different things. I mean, there are very privileged forms of migration, and I think when you were sort of putting that into the discussion, you were probably thinking more of the kinds, the less privileged and forced forms of migration of great political concern in Europe and many other places today. And I mean, that's actually another distinction that one would have to make. I mean, a lot of migration obviously occurs outside Europe in non-European concepts, more migration than anything that goes into Europe. But I will speak to sort of the European context for a minute. I think my take on this is that in the short term I'm quite pessimistic about this. It seems to me that the way that we're confronted with this issue by the media and that we're confronting it ourselves is very much as a kind of neo-colonial encounter, which doesn't really open up political space but rather closes it down, in that refugees are sort of made to fit into our, well, if I may use Rancière's language again, police order again, and that no political agency or subjectivity of refugees as agents is acknowledged at this point, and I mean that there is no properly political relationship that our Western societies are developing with refugees, at least up to this point. Maybe, hopefully this can change in the future, but I mean what strikes me, I mean I watch a little bit of Deutsche Welle German TV on TV, and I mean the talk shows in Germany for the last half year or so, or 8 months or so, I mean there's nothing but the refugee issue. And what strikes me is that in these various talk shows that I've seen, I've never seen a refugee in the talk show, and I think that's a big problem. And that would be the beginning of politics, to include refugees in these kinds of talk shows. So that's neither here nor there. I think that's my comment on that question. AJ's question, self-estrangement as a precondition for transitioning to a pluriverse. I mean, I didn't mean to put it that, I don't know, rigidly. What I simply meant to say is I don't think anybody has to do provincialization or self-estrangement. This is really what I see myself as being able to do in a conversation like this. because I don't, this is not my expertise, it's not my empirical expertise, Latin American politics or indigenous politics, so I can't really contribute to that conversation in that sense, but what I can perhaps contribute a little bit is to try to question the tradition, if you will, in which I have also been educated, and to show its particularity. I mean, show that we have to, in a sense, other that tradition as well, and I mean, just as much as non-modern or different traditions are being othered, but it's not a necessary step. It's simply one element, one contribution in sort of making space for political pluriverse. And the third question, relationships between different resistance movement in different places. Again, I really can't speak to that sort of on an empirical level. Perhaps sort of the theoretical point that I would, I didn't really have it in my presentation, I had it in my written part, but I didn't talk about it. The theoretical point that I would make here is that I think what's important about this is not to mistake any kinds of alliances that occur along these lines. I mean, when you think about, say, indigenous politics in the UN context or something like that, not to mistake that for a new form of identity politics. I think that's something broader and something beyond identity politics is what is called for and what is perhaps happening too. And this is also what I was referring to, again, not in reference to some of the work which I've read, in terms of tactical alliances between indigenous activists and environmentalists or people who support sustainable design or something like that, if you will. And this is, I mean, politics beyond identity politics. So subjectivation in that sense means to recognize difference and to articulate difference in a kind of contentious form of community, but to have community at the same time as one recognizes and respects alterity.
I'm actually going to jump in just very briefly in response to Ben's question. I think another piece of the puzzle is how we define an important political community called the nation. And it takes me back to a book, one of my favorite books, Imagined Communities by Benedict Anderson, who, by the way, was the external examiner on Christina's PhD thesis many years ago. And I was thinking sort of in terms of European stories, like I'm most familiar with the Swedish way of telling their story, is as if they grew out of the rocks, and we have these ethnically, culturally homogeneous people who've been there forever, which actually isn't true. But I remember sort of taking a former student of mine around an exposition in Stockholm of telling the story of Sweden. And suddenly in the 1960s, the foreigners arrived for the first time, as if, in fact, there have been migrations sort of all through history that have populated Scandinavia and elsewhere. So there's that kind of story in Europe, which makes it then very hard to take the newcomers. They're always the other. And in Canada, we have a different way of telling our story. We're a settler country, which means we have a very great difficulty in understanding the position of indigenous peoples. So. Did you want to? Good.
Can I ask one?
Yes, please.
I'm Root Gorlick. With respect to the Anthropocene, one of the primary ways that people have engineered the world is by setting fires, intentionally setting fires. And we're gradually realizing that some birds, especially raptors, do the same thing. They'll pick up embers and they'll set fires in various places and make it easier for them to find their food. What does that tell us about pluralism? And do these birds actually have culture and politics?
Janet?
My name is Janet Conway. So I have two questions. One is that I wanted to go back to AJ's question about the problematic of moving between worlds and ontologies, and Mario's response to that. And to ask Mario in particular, I take your point about ontologies being, produced through practices. On the other hand, people and subjectivities and worlds are also produced through practices, and they have some sedimentations. And it seems to me that it's important to recognize how those differences do create different life spaces, you know, and different subjectivities. And it creates problems of incommensurability that seem to me to be really important to also acknowledge, even as we're trying to, or we're grasping for non-essentialist ways of thinking about ontology. So I would like your sort of thoughts on that.
Can I get back to you with one thing? So what do you mean by incommensurability?
Well, I mean that in terms of ontologies being produced through practices, I take your point on that, but the practices are, they're not just a practice today, a practice tomorrow, because your response was that this capacity to move between worlds is already within you, already within us. And I guess I take some exception to that, because I think that in practices that are sedimented and embedded and reproduced and repeated also do produce qualitatively different worlds and different life spaces, and different subjectivities arise from those life spaces that create the kind of materialized ontologies that we experience as different, and that there are real challenges of translation and communicability across those worlds, and that the hybridities that you spoke of as being within us, yes, are there, but nonetheless there are still real differences, and those differences produce moments of or planes of incommensurability. And it seems to me that in terms of thinking about the pluriverse and thinking about intercultural communication across worlds, that it's really, really important to allow space for incommensurability. Mm-hmm. So I'd just like your thought on that. I mean, I'll get my turn to talk this afternoon, so I'll come back to it, but I just wanted to come back to you on that. And then the second question I wanted to ask was, I detected a tension among the speakers, and maybe I'm wrong, but let me just put it out there and ask you to comment on it. And it's about in the transition to the pluriverse that we're talking about. What, if any, is the importance or the role of some kind of alternative universalism? And because I heard differences among you. I know in Hans Peter's paper, he didn't speak to it so much, but in the paper, he ends with a kind of appeal or an argument for an alternative universalism, you know, founded on different principles, but an alternative universalism that remains the foundation of the pluriverse. And Cristina ended her talk with an appeal to a kind of a new cosmopolitanism, or a new way of thinking about cosmopolitanism. And Mario, I think, was saying something quite different, which is that the pluriverse is really about a deep acknowledgement of diversity, multiplicity, heterogeneity, that I think sounded to me like it's at odds with those other two conclusions. So I just invite you to sort of address, are you all saying the same thing, or are you actually saying different things?
Good. So, incommensurability. Okay, one of the things, I guess, the language of crossing worlds is what tripped me out. Because it's not a matter of that there is a distance to traverse, because the other world is already here. And precisely, you come across the other on your skin. That's how, when you register the difference, which it doesn't necessarily, when I'm saying that the capacity is in you, it's not the capacity to cross and become the other, not at all. If by that is what you were kind of understanding, and then the problem of incommensurability that you bring. What I refer is that it is already here. You don't have to go anywhere because it's not like a travel. Oh, I have to go to some field work to experience the other world. It is permanently is coming across you in many different instances. It doesn't, precisely because you cannot read it. you just sense something that it interrupts your practice, your understanding, then you can try to capture it. And that's what social sciences have done permanently. Turn it around, that which is different, categorize it, give it, tame it, and oh, now I know it. Right? Now, why I was asking you what you were referring to incommensurability, because one of the problems that I think that many times incommensurability is implicitly assumed to mean the same that incommunicability, and there are two different things. The world of my dog is incommensurable with my world. Let's say that way. And when I say world, is the practices, is the living, is think it in terms of our worldings. Okay, it's incommensurable, but I can communicate. Now you have to catch communication here, something very different than the usual assumption that communication is the transfer of a content of information that pass from me to you without transformation, and think communication more as is a making of a relation. The communication works as long as it holds that relation. You never know if the other got you. If you communicated the thing, you permanently in a relationship, you are guessing and you are reading, and because the relationship keep going and it holds, that you assume that the communication is operating. But there is no warranty that until the communication falls down, and there's, oh, well, no, we were not understanding each other. But does it, my point get, or I'm muddling it too much? The difference between communication or incommunication and incommensurability, because incommensurability is basically we cannot measure each other with the same stick. We cannot. We don't have something, a common third point to measure our differences in relation to each other. That's what it boils down to. Where did I go with this? So the sedimentation that you are saying in terms of the practices, definitely. And precisely are those sedimentations that, to me, are the ones that mark on the skin, on your own experience, this is not the same. Yeah, that might happen. I mean, the interesting thing that you have many possibilities of these encounters, you know, ones in which you don't even notice, because there is no rigid, let's call it that way, the practices do not touch each other. They run parallel, they don't touch each other. The point is when they touch each other and what happens. If they interrupt each other, in other cases, it's not always happen. I will give you an example from Labrador. The Innu hunters help biologists to put collars in the caribou for the biologists to track the caribous. Now, with this technology, then the wildlife division of the province decide hunting quotas and a whole sort of things that interrupt the hunting practices of the Innu. It interrupts in the sense that it's interfering on what they will do otherwise. But at the same time, that information that comes from the colors go to a satellite that then is downloaded, that the GPS tracking is that, or used to be downloaded in a website in the Quebec Ministry of the Environment, and the Innu will go to the Innu Nation office and check on the computers, go to the website and check around where were the caribou herds, so that they can go by skidoo or by plane to these areas now, in order for them to keep sustaining this relationship with caribou. So you have here both a practice that on the one hand it produces an interruption, but in the other is kind of synergetic with the, so the possibilities are multiple here of the kind of encounters between worldings practices.
I guess I can only speak to the question about, well, I mean, I can't answer the question if we're all talking about the same thing, but my impression is that we're not contradicting each other. I mean, I didn't get to this part of my presentation, this alternative form of universalism, and the ideas in that section of the written version are entirely unoriginal, as I was saying before, because I'm basically channeling the thoughts of another scholar, Sergei Prozorov, in his new book, Ontology and World Politics. But I mean, when Cristina asked me to be part of this panel, I had started to read that book, and I saw a lot of resonance between that book and the themes that we're discussing on this panel. And so, I mean, my understanding is that there's no contradiction between this new, well, what Prozorov calls void universalism, which does not posit a particular ontology of the world, capital W, as such, but sees the world sort of as an ontological void, and the multiplicity of worlds with a small w that this void can bring forth or can allow for. I mean, it's a very complicated Heideggerian Badiou type of argument, and I'm not even sure if I can entirely follow it myself. But it seems to me that, and I mean, Prozorov himself rejects the notion of cosmopolitanism or even cosmopolitics. The cosmos is too bound up with older forms of universalism that project kind of hegemony or something like that. So he would reject the term cosmopolitics, but I think that the term could still be appropriate in this context, and perhaps to sort of just explain one small element of this new universalism, or why should one call this a universalism. I think that's the same as with Rancière. I think this presupposition of equality on the part of those who have no part, that is a universal attribute, not a deep ontology or anything like that, but a universal attribute of politics. Whenever those who are dispossessed, who are excluded, claim equality, that is when we see a political practice, and that there's something universal about that. And then Prozorov extends that to, I mean, he posits two further universal axioms: freedom and community. And yes, this is all eerily close to liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberté, égalité, fraternité. But I mean, Prozorov does not mean to connote anything like that. I mean, these are sort of formal axioms of politics which, as with Rancière's formulation, need to be verified in practice, and as such they become political. So, I mean, this is also Rancière's approach to human rights. I mean, not as abstract universal political principles, but as something that allows people to make claims. So my answer is, in short, to the question is, I don't think we're necessarily in contradiction with each other, but I have to let the two other panelists speak to that as well.
Yeah, on the same issue, yeah, there is this cosmopolitics, but it's very different that can cosmopolitanism or one humanity or one government, or are you talking in your paper, one hegemony or a collective will universal, but rather it's more in terms of the cosmopolitics of Strasser, that she's talking about partial connections. That is, there are not units, not pluralism. That I think that the main issue or discussion is between these cosmopolitanisms and either universalisms or pluralism, that there are a lot of units that are self-constituted, but rather how that is, there cannot be parts that will conform the whole, but rather how there are units are forms for these parts, and from these units is intraconnection, let us say, rather than interconnected. It's intraconnection. So in that sense, you can have an articulation, as I explained in the case of Bolivia, for example, the peasant, the trade unions, the cocalero, and the indigenous from the lowlands. There are different in terms of their kind of history that each one enact, but at the same time there is one moment where they can put that and connect their similarities and difference in a project that is not forever. And I think that's the other thing that is not guarantee. It's rather politics what is going to hold that this assembling of different understanding and different practices can reach a certain agreement that is not permanent, and it's politics what make that, or subjectification that makes that happen.
Does anyone want to address the bird question?
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Birds and embers.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't think that there is a contradiction. Then I'm going to go with the bird. I like that. But there are variations, I think, of the emphasis, and this is something that I'm trying to figure out too. That I sense. I feel myself trying to move in a slightly different direction that, for example, Latour or Stenger's ideas of cosmopolitics that have some resonance with what you are pointing out of this idea of void universalism. It ends up being like the pluriverse or the common world, even with all its difference. It ends up being a whole. And I think that this has to do with this proposition of void universalism. To me, it reveals what it seems a permanent anxiety in, let's call it, Western traditions of preoccupations. You know, there have been, I don't know, you were mentioning, you know, like these different theological narratives and so on, but there is a substrate, a preoccupation with coming to the fundamentals. And in order for me to exist and to propose something about the world, I have to make a fundamental claim about how it is. And that's where, you know, at the end, the most sophisticated, if you want, possibility comes like this kind of void universalism that can contain everything in. And I am more interested in another possibility. I'm just trying to think about it, you know, that has to do with pragmatism. And a story about Thomas King, the writer, made me think about it. This maybe you have heard about these stories, the truth about stories, and he has a series of stories that it began with the question: what is the world? Well, the world is a turtle. What is under the turtle is turtles all the way down. And the point of that story is that who cares about the fundamentals? The point becomes what the story that you are telling, what it makes possible. So I do not need to make a claim for a fundamental, and that's why the way that I'm thinking about the pluriverse is a proposal that needs to be enacted. It is a story that is being proposed as a possibility, and in part the proposal is like saying we have gone with the fundamentals, we have gone with the universalism, and this is where we are. And this is what has been produced. What happens if you try with the pluriversal story? Let's say that it is a pluriverse, but it's not as a fundamental claim to reality, but it's more like, say, let's see if it holds and what it produces. And it's inspired by all these territories, movements, and so on that interestingly enough, are very much articulated on those very, very situated worlds. You know, it's not like, okay, the world is that. It's my world is like this. So I think that that's a little bit of the different strands that may take this thing. Now with the birds, and there is a lot of I mentioned in one part of my presentation these multi-species stories that are coming through that is precisely thinking of the political community as something that is more than human. And this kind of observation have made, are part of what fueled this understanding, you know, these proposals of, yeah, it's not just culture just for humans. I mean,
I think we've come close to the lunch break, so I'd like to thank all three panelists for a really stimulating set of presentations.
thank you.